Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. If you're a Londoner like me, then you'll almost certainly avoid Leicester Square like the plague. Leicester Square provides the opportunity to experience some quintessentially English experiences like the M&M's store. But I wonder if I'm perhaps being slightly unfair and if there aren't a few pubs of note in the area that might be worth featuring. So I've come to this part of town today and I'm going to see what it has to offer on the historic pub front. Cheers from the Imperial. This is on Leicester Street, which is just off Leicester Square. It's basically a bit of a disaster. There was a major refurbishment in, I think, 2023, within the last year or so. And if you compare the photos on, say, Google Maps of the interior prior to 2023, it looked like there might have been some glimpses of possibly Victorian features still remaining. There was quite an attractive bar back before. Don't know if it was original from the Victorian period or not. Had two marble columns. There was an old fireplace with similar edge glass around it. All of that now gone. There's a really horrible turquoise paint job. It sadly has very little today to recommend itself. Anyway, let's crack on with some history blurb. 1874, the current building, and what pub suggests that it was named for Queen Victoria, who of course at that time was the self-titled Empress of India. I suspect there's probably some tie-in with the Empire Theatre on Leicester Square, which is just around the corner. That was built in 1884. Prior to the 1890s, it was known as the Bell Tavern. The earliest newspaper reference I could find to it was from 1810. Tempting to think this pub might have been named for Sir Charles Bell, so a person rather than the object Bell. He was an eminent anatomist, originally from Edinburgh, lived here from 1805 to 1811, and also used his house here on Leicester Street as a sort of lecture theatre and to give practical sessions in anatomy, which probably involve cutting up dead bodies. Slight wrinkle to that theory being that that earliest newspaper mention of 1810 refers to it as the Blue Bell rather than just the Bell. One interesting newspaper article I found from 1890, at which time it was still called the Bell but just on the cusp of being renamed to the Imperial, was about lovies from the nearby theatres apparently going into this pub, finding drinkers at the bar, offering to ply them with drinks so that they would then go and either cheer or boo at specific songs in nearby stage productions. In more recent years it apparently became a bit of a celeb hangout, presumably celebrities from premieres at the nearby Empire Theatre on Leicester Square. A few names that have been associated with this pub, whether or not this is apocryphal I don't know, include the likes of Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Moss. The exterior today is stucco fronted from the first floor up. It has some Doric pilasters and there's a simple curved pediment at the rooftop. It's a Green King pub today. On the bar they had Green King's IPA, Abbott Ale, and is there possibly a seasonal beer called Scrum Down Golden Ale, which I went for, which is, it's all right. Really a bit of a shame about the Imperial. I had never been here before. It's a pub that I'd often walk past because I have a favourite Chinese restaurant nearby, and sort of considered over the last few years whether I ought to poke my nose in and try it out. And I wish I had prior to last year, because looking at those old photos, there were at least some possible remnants of the Victorian interior, or at least things that had a bit of a feel of a Victorian era interior. But today there really is nothing. Just pub number 2, the Round Table. Cheers from the Round Table. I just added this onto the list at the last minute, so I didn't really do any particularly thorough research about this pub, but I thought it was an interesting little compact boozer. It's on an alleyway and I've always had a soft spot for alleyway pubs. I've unusually had to come back here after doing all the other pubs because I got chatting to 3 charming young people earlier.
We found a guy at the pub. He's called
Tweedy.
Tweedy. He's really cool. He does like this documentation. It's great. It's amazing. It's great. It's cool. It's great. Subscribe. Appreciate it. Subscribe right now.
And just forgot to do all the blurb when I was here previously. According to the pub's history, or now London Wiki website, it was established in around 1828, and What Pub reports it as having been rebuilt in 1894. You can clearly see a public house marked at this location here on St Martin's Court on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. The earliest newspaper mentions that I was able to find go back to 1851, fascinatingly, for the Philanthropic Society of Hairdressers of all nations. It's not listed by Historic England, and it's not on camera's list of historic pubs. It has a 2-bay frontage, and the cornice is interrupted by pediments that have corbels underneath, and that's consistent with the frontage of neighbouring Jay Shiki, the seafood restaurant, which dates back to 1896. At the centre of the frontage of the pub, there is what I believe is a Windsor lantern on a curved bracket. Not sure how old that is, but there are photos of the frontage of this pub on the London Picture Archive going back to 1972. Unfortunately, can't show them here for copyright reasons, but you can see the lamp was in place at that time. There are 2 functioning doors into the interior today, and there's also another, looks like a vestige of a former door around about the middle of the pub. So it could be that at one time there were actually 3 distinct spaces on the interior of this pub, which would be surprising because it's a fairly small pub. The upper panes of the windows are leaded with that sort of diamond-shaped pattern, and you can also see that on those 1972 photos from the London Picture Archive, but it extended down to the lower panes of the windows as well. At that time there was some stained glass, it looks like, from the outside shots. That sadly is no more. The bar counter appears to contain drawers on the exterior, which is quite an unusual feature, and I think at least the sort of the facing of that bar counter must be fairly modern, looking at the state of the wood. The bar back could possibly be older. There's some matchboard panelling on the wall to one side, and there's a nice etched glass mirror. It's hard to tell the date of that behind the bar, but that's certainly in the style of a Victorian barback fitting, if not a genuine Victorian barback fitting. I had actually never been to this pub before, and I find it sort of oddly charming, actually. It's I've always had a bit of a soft spot for small pubs and pubs down alleyways, and this delivers on both of those fronts. It's obviously at various times of the day an absolute throng of tourists in here, but that's to be expected given the location. It's yet another Green King pub. They seem to only have one of the hand pumps working. That was Green King's IPA, which is something I've been avoiding because I have this terror of IPAs, but this is an old-fashioned IPA. It's not, you know, in the modern sense with Citra or Cascade or whatever those hops are that make it taste grapefruity. It is presumably something like Fuggles or Goldings or whatever, and it's sort of more like a bitter, really, stylistically. That's in, you know, reasonably good shape. It's fine. Pub number 3, the Salisbury. Cheers from the Salisbury. This is probably the finest example of late Victorian pub architecture / interiors in the immediate vicinity around Leicester Square. It was built in the 1890s, the current incarnation of the pub, and it was named for Robert Gascoigne Cecil, the 3rd Marquis of Salisbury, who was 3 times Prime Minister in the late Victorian running into the early Edwardian period. The first newspaper mention I could find with the name Salisbury, or at that time the Salisbury Stores, was from 1867. It was, I think, around 1865 when the pub changed its name. Prior to that, it was known as the Coach and Horses. Interestingly, it has a long-running association with boxing. In 1851, there is a newspaper account that the pub was destroyed by fire, and at that time it was owned by the boxer Ben Cornt. It's possible that Ben Cornt may have been the historical figure after whom Big Ben was named, although that is disputed. And prior to that, in 1842, it was owned by Jack Hannon, another prize fighter. Prior to that, Edward Baldwin in 1830, and even prior to that, quite possibly Henry Pierce was also the owner of this pub, dating back to 1809 when he's reported to have died here. On the exterior, you're greeted just above the door by a cartouche containing the Marquis of Salisbury's coats of arms. It's in 4 quarters. 2 of those quarters are conger eels, and those come from the Gascoigne side of the family. and the other 2 quarters have lions on a blue and white field, and they're from the Cecil side of the family. There are fluted pilasters around the ground floor frontage with elaborate capitals. They're sort of composite capitals, but some of them also have heads in them. They're slightly reminiscent of kind of classical figures, possibly even Greek gods. There are swags either side of that cartouche linking to a pair of cherubs, and that clock above the doorway dates back to at least the 1960s, originally contained some brewery livery. Was it possibly in Coupe? You can see it in a London Picture Archive photo from 1968. The pub is listed on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors. They say one of the most remarkable things is that the partition separating what was at one time the snug still is retained, even though some of the other partitions have since been removed. So there is still a distinct bar space on the St Martin's Court entrance to the pub. The other entrance on the corner of the pub has a grand vestibule, and there's some impressive etched glass panels in there. The bar counter appears to be original, and there is an interesting telltale sign, as reported by CAMRA's Pub Heritage site, of where the original partitions in the internal spaces would have occurred, because you can see the bar counter top switching from mahogany to marble. More etched glass is to be found in the spectacular barback fitting, and also some rather nice wood carving. There are mirrors around the walls of the entire space, but CAMRA reports that it's probably only the mirror over to the left hand side as you come through the main entrance, the one with the vestibule, that is original, and it does look like some of the other ones look a bit more modern than that. There are cast iron columns holding up once again a lincrusta ceiling, and close to that one original mirror is a rather attractive sort of lampstand in an Art Nouveau style containing 2 female figures. It's a Green King pub today. They seem to have a bit of a stranglehold on the historic pubs in this part of town, as in most of London. I went for Old Speckled Hen just for a bit of a change from the past couple of pubs. It's all right, it's fine. Pub number 4, the Chandos. Not sure how to pronounce that. Cheers from the Chandos, is it? According to what pub, there may have been a pub on this site as far back as 1710. It was originally named the Bull's Head and was renamed the Chandos in around about 1890. It was presumably named for the Duke of Chandos and took its name from Chandos Street, which at one time was this pub's address. The modern sign certainly shows some version of the coat of arms of the Dukes of Chandos. I found a series of newspaper articles from the 1890s with a series of various unfortunate events and crimes associated with this pub, including a savage assault on a policeman, for which the perpetrator was given 3 months hard labour, which seemed like a very lenient sentence considering the severity of the injuries that the policeman suffered, and particularly if you compare that to a just slightly earlier incident reported in the newspaper of a barmaid who had been working here, who had stolen some trinkets from the proprietor and part of a bottle of vermouth, and was given 4 months hard labour. There's also an account from 1896 of the publican's divorce, and that involved some domestic violence. So it's certainly the 1890s were a bit of a rough period for this pub. You can see a public house on this site very clearly marked on the Ordnance Survey map of the 1890s. And it seems throughout most of the 19th century this corner building would have had the address 28 St Martin's Lane. You can see that quite clearly both on the 1799 map from Hallwood and also Gode's 1887 map. The exterior today has a ground floor frontage in wood. I think that's a relatively modern addition. It looks quite new, the wood, and if you look back to London Picture Archive photos from the 1970s, you can see it had a tiled exterior. The upper floors have stucco with some classical detailing. There's triangular pediments over the windows and so on. Probably the most notable feature of the exterior is the balcony and alcove at the top of the building on the corner that has an automaton Cooper, and that is the work of toy maker Ron Fuller. Inside, I'm not really sure if much of the interior is original. It has bare floorboards today. There are stained glass windows that almost certainly date only as far back as its tenure as a Sam Smith's pub, so I assume that's sort of 1990s. I mean, they're quite attractive, and they add a nice light to the interior, quite a dim interior actually. There are some tiles around the outer walls as well, and probably the nicest feature are a line of booths, which at least one source I read said were original, but I doubt very much these date back to the late Victorian period or anything like that. As I said, it's a Sam Smith's pub today, has been as long as I've known it at least. It looked as though the old brewery bit was off, but perhaps I was looking at the wrong hand pumps there, so I instead went for some of their dark mild, which I think is a keg beer rather than a cask beer, but it's pretty pleasant actually, and it was almost certainly this is going to be the cheapest beer of the day at just over £2. Is it £2.15 for a half? Overall, I get the sense of a not particularly old interior. I doubt much of the fabric that we see now dates back to before the Sam Smith's tenure of this pub, but it's certainly a nice quiet pub. There's no pipe music, as is the way with all Sam Smith's pubs, and the booth seating does give you some sort of cosy little hideaways to sit and enjoy a quiet pint of Sam Smith's beer. Happens to be your thing. Pub number 5, the Porcupine. Cheers from the Porcupine. The sign outside the pub says that there may have been a pub on this site going back as far as 1725, and the London Metropolitan Archives at least have records going back to 1768. The current shape of the building is very clearly visible on Hallwood's 1799 map here on the corner of Great Newport Street, and as it was then, Castle Street, which is now known as Charing Cross Road. And you can also see it again on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map with the same shape of the building, and it's marked PH for public house. The question I found most intriguing, which didn't seem to be answered either on the potted history of the pub on the sign just outside or any of the other sources that I saw online, is why is it called the Porcupine? It seems like quite a specific and unusual name, and it turns out that the Porcupine is in fact a heraldic device, and it relates to Robert Sidney, the 2nd Earl of Leicester, who owned most of the surrounding land. He purchased some of the land in this area in 1630 and built Leicester House. The ground just in front of that became Leicester Fields because he was required to maintain an area of common land, and then eventually that then subsequently turned into Leicester Square as we know it today. So the coat of arms, or the crest of the Sidney family, incorporates a porcupine, and that dates back to, I believe, is it the great grandfather of Robert Sidney, and he in turn took this from Louis XII of France. It had some bearing on a spat between an even earlier ancestor of his, the Duke of Orleans, spat between him and the Duke of Burgundy, and the porcupine is a sort of symbol of kind of ferocious defiance. It's very much a corner pub and has been, as far as we can tell, for most of its history. It has 3 entrances, which presumably indicates that at some point there would have been 3 distinct bar spaces inside. There's some really nice gilded carving around both the window frames and the doorways, and perhaps the nicest part of that is some carving of a porcupine above one of the doorways over on the left hand side. There is something like a cartouche, I think it may well be ironwork, above the door to the centre that bears the name of the pub, the Porcupine. This is not listed on camera's list of historic pub interiors, nor is this a listed building by Historic England, so we don't have a huge amount to go on in terms of commentary. But the bar back, the What Pub site, draws attention to some of the tiling. I'm not sure if that's of Victorian era, but it's certainly quite attractive. There is other tiling in various areas on the walls around the pub. There are at least stubs of partitions which may give clues to how those internal spaces were divided up when those 3 entrances originally led into 3 distinct bar spaces. There are a few columns in the interior. I get the sense, comparing the way it looks now to some older photos, that the capitals have been changed, which is a bit sad. But one of those columns has been, I think, quite nicely adapted into a little drinks table, the one in the middle of the main bar room. There is also an upstairs room which is now given over to dining and was mostly closed off on my visit, so I had to take little bits of footage through the window in the door to that. It's a Nicholson's pub today. Sadly, all the hand pumps were not working apparently, which was disappointing because they had tea on tap and I was quite keen to try those. So I've had to go for some just generic Guinness off the keg taps instead. It's time to sign off here from the round table, wonderfully cheek by jowl with the shops selling essential supplies to tourists, one presumes. A handful of pubs around Leicester Square. The Imperial, definitely a disappointment in its current form, but I think the Salisbury can hold its head up high as having some really quite impressive late Victorian features. The rest a bit of a mixed bag, but at least one really solid pub in the area is probably better than I expected. Generally speaking, if I were in Leicester Square, my instinct would always be to head to Soho or down to sort of the more Charing Cross Strand area and head for the much more characterful pubs in that area. But if you are stuck in Leicester Square, then hopefully there are some reasonable options presented for you there. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.